Well, hi there. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. Happy Thursday. I'm joined by Chris, and for once in Massachusetts, it is not raining. So that is a big deal, although I believe it's going to rain all weekend. So here we are. Uh, in today's show, we're talking about vetting source credibility. We're going to talk through tips to determine if there's a conflict of interest, meaning that someone is posting something that's promotional, but they're not disclosing necessarily. And so making sure you're staying away from using that kind of information, using your own data to determine some trends, and how to use credible sources, the so what of it all. So, Chris, where do you want to start?
I think actually in some ways you probably should start with the so what of it, which is that if you if you're making decisions with data and you're getting data from third parties, meaning it's not your own, you have to know like what ingredients you're working with. It where did they come from? Are they credible? And by credible, I think we mean a few things. We mean, is it from a source that you can trust? Is it the data you work with correct? Is the data you're working with fresh? Like you said, Katie, is it conflicted? And do you know where that data came from? Sort of the provenance or the lineage. Katie, you spent a number of years in healthcare. Um, when when you were working with third party data, how did you decide like yes, this data is credible or no, this data is not?
So I worked in pharmaceutical and clinical trial research. And so a lot of the data that we used to supplement what we were doing was government data. And so things like SAMHSA and NSAIDs. And so those are self report data sources, if I remember correctly. I'm now going back over a decade. Um, but they're self-report. And so the idea is that they weren't out surveying the different clinics or the substance abuse counselors, but those clinics were self-reporting, and basically they had to fill out information and submit it once a year or once a quarter. Um, and so so that methodology in some ways takes out the I have an agenda, because the organization, the governing organization, the that's publishing the data, theoretically they shouldn't be changing it. They shouldn't be influencing the information. And so where we did start to run into issue was if we were running a commercial survey, a survey that was sponsored by a pharmaceutical company, we had to be very clear about disclosing who was sponsoring the information, because obviously the pharmaceutical company had an agenda of the information they wanted to collect. They wanted to collect information specifically about their thing, and they wanted it to be a certain way. I mean, we run into these issues at pretty much any company that's running some sort of a consumer survey. They're doing it because, either they want to know information, maybe shed in a good light, or they want to collect information that they can then turn around and share publicly that paints them in a good light. And that's not always what you get back. And so that's one of the challenges of sponsored content or sponsored surveys, is the person sponsoring it a lot of times has, whether it's a conscious or unconscious agenda of how they want the information to turn out. And that was one of the challenges with pharmaceutical sponsored surveys, is that people didn't trust them. They're like, well, big pharma is asking you to collect this information from me, so why do I want to tell you anything?
Hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, certainly in the last 16 months, we've had a chance, all of us, collectively, to evaluate new information and try to decide, can we believe it, right? There's no shortage of people who are sharing really bad information, particularly around the pandemic. And there's no shortage of people who are sharing really good information too. And I was giving some thought to this as we were talking, getting ready for this show, and I came up with a short list of about 5 things that I know I do personally, and I'd love to have you weigh in on them. Um, there's 5 areas I think are for credibility. One is the credentials, both of the individual and the sponsoring company. Like when Trust Insights publishes content in our newsletter, right? We are the institutional sponsor of the thing. And you ask questions like, is it a known entity, or I guess more crassly, can you sue this company? Like, if we give out bad advice, can you sue us? Like, the answer is like, yes, we exist. You can look us up in a business directory, find our IRS tax number, all that stuff. And then at the person level, does the person have authentic, verifiable credentials of some kind? Like when we're looking at people sharing information about a brand new virus, like is the person sharing this a virologist, right? Is this their life's work, or is this some random guy on Facebook, or some YouTube celebrity who is popular but doesn't have any actual expertise in the topic? So I think that's the first area. Anytime we're evaluating any sources, look at the credentials of the individual and the institution behind the individual.
So the example you give of someone sharing information about a virus, the person should have some sort of, medical background. It would probably be helpful. That's pretty straightforward. It's not as straightforward in, say, the marketing industry. So a lot of marketers don't have a marketing degree because you don't necessarily need a marketing degree in order to do marketing. I have my undergrad is, a communications degree, specifically TV and film. That has literally nothing to do with marketing. So one could look at my degree and go, well, why is she telling me anything? She doesn't have her master's in business. She doesn't have a marketing degree. So I can't take anything she says seriously. So how do you reconcile that situation?
That's a really good point, and that's where being well regarded by other experts in the field is helpful. When you survey and ask people, like, this person's affiliations, what are they affiliated with? An institution, a company of some kind that is at least exists and appears credible. It's one of the reasons why you will see whenever marketers are talking, like these are the clients we've worked with T-Mobile, we've worked with AT&T, we've worked with so on and so forth, because that badge value essentially says other organizations trusted this person or this company to do work for them, whether or not they did any good work or not. At least the logos there. At least they had that experience. But there is that whole aspect of being well regarded by other experts. There are certainly a lot of things that you can do, like write a book or whatever, and things that create those additional heuristics. But one of the clear signs to me is almost like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, right? So, this person's connected to this person's connected to this person. Well, this person at the start of the chain is a known trustworthy person, right? How many degrees of connection, and how strong are those degrees to say, like, yeah, this person is probably trustworthy. So, a silly example. There are a number of people who will begrudgingly say, okay, I at least know what I'm doing within a certain area, right? And you're affiliated with me, and Trust Insights is affiliated with me, and so therefore there's 1 degree of separation between the two of us. So by that same extension, you have that credibility if someone's tracing that research through me. If someone's tracing that research through John Wall, right? They're a fan of marketing over coffee, and they see that John works with Trust Insights, you work with Trust Insights. Again, they following that lineage. So there are, in cases where there isn't a clear academic credential or some kind of certification, that does help. The other thing to point out that there certainly are other certifications, like you are a Google Analytics certified professional, a Google Ads certified professional, in a HubSpot certified professional. In the absence of other markers, those are things that at least you took the time and effort to get them, right? Even if
Mhm.
your opinion of like HubSpot's or Google's or whoever's certification, maybe okay, it exists. I don't know how much faith to put in. At least the person made the effort, as opposed to somebody who hasn't.
Mhm. Fun fact, I am 1 degree from Kevin Bacon, but that's probably for another time.
It does another time, but it'll be a fun. We should do like a year end. At the end of just do like a ridiculous random show, like
Mhm.
a live show has nothing to do about marketing.
I
Um,
think that would be an excellent idea. But to your point,
uh,
Chris, I think that that makes sense because it's interesting because what you're describing works two ways. One is credibility by association, the other is guilty by association. And
hmm,
so the credibility piece of it, so, following that example, Chris, you are well known and have certifications and are considered in the marketing space an authority on machine learning, artificial intelligence, and those kinds of topics. So by association, when I speak about it or I talk about it, I'm borrowing your credibility to build my own credibility until I'm standing on my own 2 feet in that space, at least from other people's perception. The flip side of that is, let's say people find out this is theoretical, this is not true. Let's be clear, full disclaimer, none of this is true. Let's find out that Chris Penn is a total fraud and knows nothing about artificial intelligence and has been making it up based on that Haley Joel Osment movie that he saw. Let's say that that's the case. I then, if I start speaking about artificial intelligence, I'm guilty by association
Mhm.
because I then haven't done my due diligence to find out if Chris is actually truly credible.
Exactly. And there's a fair number of people. Again, this is where that, well regarded by experts, is important. When you have a variety of people who all say yes, this person at least knows what they're doing. That's important because there are, as with anything human, bloody humans, there are certainly cliques of people like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
this person. You ask this group like, oh yes, that person's the bomb, and you ask another group of people, oh no, that person's a total whatever.
Oh,
And,
sure.
and
You
so
have the people who can do no wrong.
exactly. But in general, if you were to panel, 10 or 15 of these folks, even the folks who you're doing it right, if somebody who is not in the circles, like, yeah, they know what they're doing.
Mhm.
I don't if they like them, I don't go out to drinks with them, whatever, but they know what they're doing. They're okay.
A
Um,
good way to test that is to, amongst your Slack communities or Facebook communities, wherever else you have those kinds of communities, you can just ask the question, who do you know who's an expert on X?
mm,
And if you start to get similar names, like if you say, in a Slack community, who do you know who's an expert on Google Analytics, or who do you know who's an expert on machine learning and marketing, you would naturally assume that Chris Penn's name would come up.
hopefully. Um,
Hopefully,
so
it
that's
does. By
one.
the way,
Number two is the source that you're working with presenting factually correct data, information that is correct. And there's two important aspects here. One, if it's a more formal publication, again, this goes back to academia, there's probably been a peer review process where other people who are also independent have looked at and said, yep, this passes review. You didn't obviously screw up. Um,
Mhm.
but to your point, Katie, again, a lot of marketing is not academic, and so the second thing to look at is if this is a source that you're considering, following a blog you want to follow or something like that, look for stuff that right? So if someone's writing a blog, say about, we'll use machine learning, but they've got blog posts about Google Analytics, and Google Analytics, you can read their stuff and go, okay, they at least know their stuff within the domain of Google Analytics. So
Mhm.
I feel somewhat comfortable that they probably have at least done similar levels of homework on machine learning. On the other hand, if you read their blog and they say, yeah, and it's 2021, and they say, for Google Analytics, just install the ga.js tracking code on your website. Yeah, that's not being used 7 years ago, so that this person is not presenting factually correct data anymore. That would be number two in terms of evaluating a source.
I think that that's a really good point. If you're not looking at academic papers, I can't even recall how many times someone has shared an article with me and said, here's the latest and greatest. And the first thing we notice is, well, this was published in 2016. How is this the latest and greatest? Or even, if you think about it, how fast moving things are. One of the things that I was working on with clients, or maybe even, about 2 months ago, were some of the changes to Facebook Business Manager. And we had a really hard time finding up to date information that answered the questions. And part of that was because nobody knew the answer because Facebook wasn't really sharing the information and they made it really difficult. But the information we were finding, once we dug into it, once I was really reading through it, was speculation. And so a lot of it was published in December of 2020. And once you really sort of dug in, was this is what I think is going to happen, and this is what might be, but it's not out there yet. So we don't really know. And making sure you're not just, reading the title of an article and then sharing it, but really reading it thoroughly, because you could be sharing something that then makes you look like you're not credible. Because again, going back to, you need to do your homework and make sure that you're not sharing information that is theoretical and not actually, something that's happened and factual and up to date.
Exactly, which is the point number 3, which is, are things up to date or not? Um, Again, anytime you're working with data, data is like fruit. When it's fresh, it's better. Um, a lot of the times, older data can be really hazardous, especially right now, right? We're 16 months, 17 months into a pandemic that has changed everything about life. If you're still working, substantively with data from prior to March 2020, and
Hmm.
making important decisions based on it without looking at the data since then, you're at risk. That currentness is important. The fourth is are you working with a source that's conflicted in some way? And this is where we get into some interesting stuff. The thing that we're looking for are material conflicts of interest. So, uh, real simple example, when I publish my personal newsletter, I have to disclose like that the things I'm earning money on. Like when I share a link to say Agorapulse, I'm an ambassador of theirs, and they have they sent me money? No, they haven't sent me money, but they do send me swag. But there is a conflict of interest because they're giving me something in expectation of something else, right?
Hmm.
But the important part, I think, there is that material clause. Is it a conflict of interest that would negate the data source? Like what you were saying earlier, when a pharma company is sponsoring, a study, it's like a cigarette company sponsoring a study that smoking isn't harmful. Like there's a
Right.
material conflict of interest there.
So a really good example, I actually ran into this the other day. So one of the things that we're doing right now at Trust Insights is we are reviewing different project management tools. And so, there's a whole host of them out there. I've been asking our community what they like the best. And so, of course, naturally, I was Googling, like, best tools for productivity, best project management tools for collaboration, and those kinds of things. And what I got back were articles authored by one of the many software tools out there, giving that list of, here are the top 10 best project management tools. And so I'd be like, oh, this should be interesting. Wouldn't they say that they are the best? And lo and behold, the articles, while not obvious, were written in such a way that painted their tool in the best light. So they would review other tools. They wouldn't, tear them down and slam them, but none of the tools lived up to all of the really great things that the author's tool did. And so that is a not as obvious conflict of interest, other than the fact that the company wrote the review of all of the other tools, including their own. So that you can sort of make that, natural leap to, well, they're probably going to paint theirs the best. Very few companies are going to go out there and be like, yeah, ours isn't the greatest. Maybe it's not for you.
Exactly. And the marker that I look for, and again, this comes from having now read, months and months of pandemic related literature and studies, is a very specific thing. It's disclosures. What disclosures does any piece of content have? And I'll give you a real simple example. If you look in the Trust Insights newsletter, every week, there's a piece of data of some kind. And at the end, is this sentence: is, we are the sole sponsor of the study. We neither gave nor received compensation for the data used beyond applicable service fees, and we declare no competing interests, which again is something from more academic literature. But we're basically saying we're presenting something here that is, we don't have a material conflict of interest for. So this data, if we were presenting something, like what's the best analytics consulting firm, that's a competing interest. We would have to declare that there's an obvious competing interest here. And when you're looking at all these different articles and things, look for those disclosures. If the ideal is to see a disclosure section no matter what, even if it says disclosures, no competing interests, because again, you see that a lot in academia. We declare there aren't any issues. But if you're reading something and there isn't a disclosure, you have to wonder, as opposed to being explicit. So, a takeaway for the marketers is, if you want your stuff to be maximally trustworthy, make sure there's always a disclosure section so that you can say, like, yeah, I don't have a conflict of interest here.
The other thing to think about. So one of the things that we pride ourselves on, Chris, and we get asked this question a lot, is sort of like who you partnered with, which vendors, do you have exclusive relationships with? Trust Insights, we are vendor and platform agnostic, meaning that we're not partial to any one piece of software. We have the pieces of software that we use, but we don't use them exclusively. We will use other tools or we will promote other tools if they make sense for the situation. And we always really try to do that research to make sure that not only are we using the tool that makes sense, whether it's the most popular tool or just the tool that does the job the best, but we're then also, when we're recommending those tools to our clients and to our communities, that from our standpoint, we try to take into consideration the business requirements from the person. Is it cost? Is it this? Is it that? And, sort of whatever the other things are, and finding then the right thing that fits that situation. And so when you take that to the conversation we're having about credible sources, thinking about the organization who's publishing the information, are they known to be agnostic to all of the other things? Or do you know that, like, again, theoretical, not true at all, Trust Insights is pocketing money from one specific tool. So therefore they're always promoting that one thing. And that should really, that to Chris's point, it needs to be mentioned in disclosures, methodology, so Trust Insights partnered with, X company to, publish this research. If that's not disclosed, then we are acting unethically on our side.
Exactly. And the last category is citation, right? Which is a fancy way of saying the ingredients, like where did this stuff come from? And that, to your point, Katie, is exactly right. The methodology statement. Where did you get the data from?
Mhm.
There are any number of studies out there that will say like, hey, here's what we found. Well, great. Where did you get that data from? Um,
Right.
I'm doing stuff right now with a survey for my mailing list. Right, the data came from me, and then I have to acknowledge the biases of the people who are on my list. Right, because for example, if I'm making broad statements about here's how marketers feel about analytics, well, my audience is inherently biased towards people who are more analytical. Therefore, I can't make a broad assumption that what people say is true. Um,
Mhm.
so I figured we'd do this because I think this would be kind of fun. Let's take a look at a study, right? And ask. And if you're watching and you want to leave some comments, go ahead and feel free on the platform you're watching on um, about how credible you think this is. So this is from Mailchimp. This is email marketing benchmark statistics by industry.
Mhm.
We kind of scroll through here, and they list a whole bunch of these different things by industry, the open rates, the click through rates, and things like
Mhm.
that. Let's keep scrolling. Say the average open rate for all industries was 21%. How do you improve your open rates, which is their version of the so what?
Mhm.
The click through rate is 2.62%. Again, the
Mhm.
so what, and that's the end. So on this very quick tour, Katie, how would you rate the credibility of this based on our 5 factors?
So my gut reaction is, oh, MailChimp is publishing data on email marketing. That is what they do. Therefore, my assumption is that they have some sort of an agenda to say, if you use MailChimp as a product, therefore, this is what you're going to get. So again, that's an assumption. I don't know that that's true, because what's missing is any kind of disclosure or methodology. My assumption is that they're only using their own data, and MailChimp does not own the market in terms of email marketing. They don't cover everybody. Therefore, the data is just a segment of the market, just their segment. So, really, what this should say is email marketing benchmarks and statistics by industry that use MailChimp services.
Exactly right, because Mailchimp has a reputation, deservedly for having a lot of small business customers. Right, you can sign up for free and do all this stuff, which is going to skew the population. If you're looking for, say, enterprise email marketing data, this probably isn't it. But to your point, right,
Mhm.
there is definitely a potential conflict of interest, right?
Mhm.
And there's absolutely no citation whatsoever.
Right.
Other than that brief thing that says, from MailChimp users. Well, great. There's a whole host of issues with that. Is
Right.
it current? Yes, that it is current. It's relatively recently published. Is the data correct? This is an important one. We don't know.
Right.
We don't know whether it's correct or not. We do know what our own open and click through rates are from our own stuff. So we could, if we could find our industry, we could see if it somewhat matches up to reality. And there is an institution. There is a company behind it of some kind. So at least
Mhm.
it's not like some rando blog that we couldn't find. But in general, we're kind of at 2.5 strikes out of 5 here on this. So if you were to say, okay, I now need to go and benchmark my email marketing program, and if we're getting less than 2.62% click-through rate, we're screwing up, right? That's the message that a lot of people would take away from this. Like, if your click-through rate isn't that high, you failed.
Right.
I
Yeah,
don't think that's the case.
it's not the case, and that's problematic. And so it works if you and all of your customers are also MailChimp users, because then you fall closer into the right set of information. And so, Chris, to go back to, so you said that this is current. We know that the article publication date is current. Because there's no methodology statement, we don't know if the data itself is current. We
Hmm.
don't know how much data they used, how much data they sampled. So the data provided on this page was last updated in October 2019 and may vary from benchmarking data provided within the MailChimp application. So October 2019 in the digital marketing world is actually pretty old.
It's pre-pandemic. So
It's
actually, yeah,
pre
we'll add a third strike for not being current.
it's pre-pandemic, but pandemic or not, in the digital marketing world, it's old because the
Yeah,
expectation is that you should be able to collect near real-time information and analyze it just as quickly in order to get that information. Data that's 2 years old as a CEO doesn't help me. I can't make a decision
exactly.
with it. And that's the problem when you work sort of in an academic standpoint, because the data, the way it's collected, does come in a lot slower. They may have made advances since then, but in general, government databases work a lot slower. Digital marketing databases have a different set of expectations, and they should be near real time.
And so we're now at essentially 3 strikes out of 5. Now here's the challenge. This is the number one search result for email marketing benchmarks, right? So there's a lot of people who view this as credible. There's a lot of people who will click on this and just kind of run with it because they haven't questioned the data. So Katie, the question I would ask you is, okay, in the situation where you need data
Mhm.
and you don't have a credible source, what do we do?
It kind of puts you in a bind, but if this is, let's say that article is the latest and greatest published information, you can use it with really big caveats. So you can say, we found some places to start, and then create a plan to maybe collect your own data or work with a third party institution that doesn't do their own email marketing but can collect information and data on email marketing if you really need those benchmarks. So you can use that information that MailChimp published. You can absolutely use it as long as you disclose what it is, where you got it, that it's a small segment of the email marketing population. It doesn't represent all email marketers. So as long as you are doing your due diligence with disclosures, then you should be fine.
I would go back to something you said earlier, which is you just use your own data. If the goal, if you're asking for this information benchmarks to figure out how you're doing, in some ways, I would argue it doesn't really matter what the industry benchmark is. It matters, is your data improving over time, right? If your click-through rate is 7%, right? So you're 3 times above the industry benchmark, but it's been on the decline for 7 months.
Mhm.
Who cares what the benchmark is? You've got a problem, right? You've got a problem you need to fix because you've been declining for 7 months. On the other hand, if your click-through rate is 0.1%, but you've doubled it every month for the last 3 months,
Mhm.
keep doing what you're doing because you will eventually get to the point where you're seeing that if you can maintain that level of growth, you're going to do great. And so, to your point, Katie, focus on the data that you can trust, which is your own data
Mhm.
in those cases, and work on improving it. Again, it doesn't really matter what the competition is doing. What matters is that you're getting results out of the marketing you're trying to do.
The analogy that probably suits us the best, because I know, Chris, you really like the analogies to sort of drive the point home, is if you are working out and training for something. So, as we may have talked about in other episodes, I do training on the Peloton. I've definitely drank the Peloton Kool-Aid. Um, but they are not paying me to say any of this. So that's my
Yet.
disclosure. Well, I mean, that would be lovely, but again, different episode. The point being is they have this program called Power Zones. And so I've been working out alongside one of my friends, and her power zones are very different from mine. And every time you take a class, one of the first things that the instructor in the class says is, don't pay attention to the zones that your mother, brother, best friend, neighbor have. They have nothing to do with you. Your zones are going to be unique to you because there's so many variables and the same, of, who you are, how you approach it, what you do, your strength, your this, your that, that you can't make that one-to-one comparison. So to drive home your point, Chris, that same thing is true of industry benchmarks. It's not as straightforward as this happened, therefore it's the benchmark. There's so many other factors that don't get considered, brought in. And so, one of the things you said about MailChimp is they tend to attract a lot of small businesses. Well, they're representing this as if it spoke for enterprise size companies, but maybe that's not true. We don't know that because we don't have that methodology statement, and so you're right, Chris, focusing only on your information, your benchmarks. You may get asked by the C suite, well, what's the industry benchmark and are we performing? It's an opportunity for you politely and respectively to push back and say, who cares?
Exactly. So putting this into action, if you're trying to publish your own data as a marketing tool, as a content marketing tool, please make sure that you're following the 5 rules, right? Put your credentials and your organization's credentials up front so people can quickly go, oh, I know why you're publishing this. And I know that you have some authority to be talking about it. Make sure your data is correct, please, 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 please. Um, Even if there isn't you're not a formal academic institution, there is something to be said for an informal peer review. Like share your data with somebody under NDA if you have to.
Mhm.
Say, hey, could you look at this and sniff test it? One of the things that we do a ton at the office is, Katie, you are constantly looking over my data, my code, etc., and going, hey, this doesn't pass the sniff test. Something's wrong here. Yeah, that's peer review.
It's peer review. And you're right, Chris, it doesn't have to be a formal process. You don't have to get a whole bunch of people involved. And the other is even like in a bullet list out your methodology. From this day to this day, this is the information that I'm looking at. This is the source that it comes from. This is, this was my intention in looking at the data. It's basically having that plan. And then you can look at it and go, huh, I'm trying to understand information from, Q4, but for some reason, once I realized it, now I'm looking at data from Q2. So it's a good gut check to make sure you're even looking at the right information.
Exactly. So point 3 is make sure the data is current, that you're working with data. And there's something to be said for it. After a certain amount of time, you're almost, if you have a survey, for example, it's running for 6 months, that time factor may substantially impact your data. So make sure you understand the data source. Number
Mhm.
4, you have to have disclosures. What are your conflicts of interest? Even if you don't have any, you have to disclose you don't have any disclosures, or you should anyway. And number
Mhm.
5 is your methodology statement in detail. What is this data? Where did it come from? How reliable is it? And one other thing that we've started putting even in our client reports these days is limitations. These are the known limitations of this study. Here's what we know, for example, in one of our recent content marketing reports. So we know that our scraping tools can't get every single web page on a client's website. You get like 90% of them. But if there's a section we need to log in or it's behind a wall or something, you have to say, "Yeah, this is a known limitation of this. It's a
Mhm.
known limitation that this particular machine learning technique can't do certain things, right? It's like saying, "Hey, this blender can't make French fries." Well, yes, we know it's a limitation of the tool. In the methodology section, the more detailed you can be about the known limitations of the data that you're publishing or working with, the more trustworthy you will come across.
if you come across a piece of data, so going back to that MailChimp example, and we have nothing against MailChimp. We think they're a fantastic company. I think their services are fine, and we're just using their article as an example. If you are looking to use that information and it doesn't contain the disclosures or citations or methodology that you're looking for, reach out to them and ask. Most companies are happy to provide that information. They may not have thought to include it, or it's just not part of how they publish their content, but don't be shy about asking. Um, I say this broad strokes. Companies that have nothing to hide will very readily share that information with you. They should be sharing that information with you. And again, I've never experienced this with MailChimp. I don't want to pretend like I'm speaking about them as a, example. I'm not. If you run across a company that says, I can't tell you, or we don't have that information, or we don't share that publicly, that might be a red flag. That might be a indicator to you to maybe find a different data source. If you come to us and ask us, well, how did you collect that information? You didn't publish your methodology. We're happy to share that with you. Absolutely
Well,
happy. Have
probably
no
fix the
reason
blog
not to.
post. Exactly. So that is vetting credible sources, determining conflicts of interest, the 5 conditions, credentials, correctness, currentness, conflicts, and citations are the 5 ways to evaluate a source and figure out, yes, this seems reliable, or there could be issues. And it's always up to you as to the sort of the risk tolerance you're willing to have. Like, is this a mission critical decision? You should probably make sure all 5 boxes are checked. Is it a throwaway stat in a blog post? 2 or 3 is probably good enough for something where it is going to be not material to your business. But definitely, the more important a piece of data is to business, it's like any ingredient. The more you should be making sure it's good quality.
Well, I would with the caveat, Chris, to be careful with that whole throwaway stat in a blog post. You never know what's going to come back to bite you. So,
Mm.
you know, try not to operate that way. Like, oh, nobody will read it, or it doesn't matter. It's just this little thing. Like, believe it or not, that'll probably be the thing that, gets you called to the carpet 3 years from now. Like, hey, remember when you said this thing? It was really wrong, and people are still quoting it.
I got some blog post update, Katie. I'm just kidding.
Good luck. Have fun.
Exactly. All right. We will talk to folks next week for another episode. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and a weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.